Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating biography and, honestly, the incredibly complex legacy of pioneer American missionary Adoniram Judson. Now, for a lot of folks, his name is practically synonymous with the birth of the modern missionary movement. But as we'll see today, by looking directly at the historical evidence, the actual man behind the myth, well, he was far more intricate, conflicted, and just fundamentally fascinating than a simple, clean-cut heroic tale might suggest. So it really begs the question, who was the real Adoniram Judson? To figure that out, we have to look past the hagiography. Those overly idealized, totally uncritical biographies that have dominated his story for over a century. Instead, we're going to dive into how the traditional Christian view and the rigorous historical view of Judson's life intersect, and quite frankly, where they sometimes crash right into each other. How did a guy who spent his life in Myanmar, historically known as Burma, navigate his own super rigid theology while totally immersing himself in a completely foreign culture? Let's jump in and find out. All right, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 1. The first American missionary. 2. An ecumenical evangelical mosaic. 3. Forging the Burmese Bible. 4. A twofold cultural legacy. 5. Sacrifice and imprisonment. And finally, number 6, an enduring monument. Starting right off with Section 1, the first American missionary. Grounding our explainer in solid academic sources, like the Christian Librarian Journal you see here, we want to look at Judson not just as this untouchable religious icon, but as the very first overseas American Protestant missionary. When we shift our lens to look at his life through the eyes of scholars and historians, the narrative quickly moves beyond just a simple inspirational story and gets right into the gritty, real-world reality of cross-cultural engagement in the 19th century. Spanning from 1788 to 1850, Judson was a man on a mission for his entire life, and he definitely wasn't afraid to disrupt the status quo. In a move that completely shocked his original supporters, he actually resigned from his first mission board, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, over a massive theological shift. Get this, while literally sailing to India, he was studying the scriptures and came to a deep, personal conviction to reject infant baptism in favor of believers' baptism. That one single, arguably drastic decision on a boat effectively ignited the entire American Baptist movement in world missions. Moving right along to Section 2, an ecumenical evangelical mosaic. Now, if you thought Judson was just a strict, one-dimensional denominational cutout, well, this timeline proves otherwise. The sources show a man whose faith was this incredibly dynamic, evolving mosaic. Back in 1804, he entered college rooted in the new divinity, coming from an Edwardian Congregationalist background. By 1812, as we just talked about, he became a confirmed Baptist aboard the ship Caravan. But look at 1829. Later in his life, following some really severe trauma and personal loss, he actually adopted elements of Catholic mysticism. Honestly, he was an ecumenical evangelical way before that term was ever even a thing. So the really crucial point here is that his spiritual life became deeply shaped by a movement called Guyonism. This involved intense, demanding practices of self-denial, fasting, and secret prayer in total solitude, all inspired by Catholic mystics like Madame Guyon and Thomas à Kempis. I mean, the guy even retreated to the edges of the jungle for a total hermitage experience. This Catholic mystical influence was so totally unexpected and alarming to his Baptist contemporaries back home in America that his family and friends constantly tried to downplay or just outright hide it. All right, Section 3, Forging the Burmese Bible. Looking at the historical record completely decenters that popular lone genius myth that always surrounds Judson. While his 1840 completion of the entire Burmese Bible was an absolutely monumental historic achievement, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was actually an intertextual masterpiece built upon 300 years of prior work. If you look at this breakdown, back in 1776, a Barnabite Catholic missionary named Giovanni Maria Percodo had already translated core Christian doctrines. Then, in 1812, a British Baptist, James Chater, laid the early linguistic groundwork. So Judson was really standing on the shoulders of these earlier pioneers. By pulling from the linguistic foundation laid by predecessors like Percodo and Chater, Judson was able to refine and heavily develop key Christian discourse for the Burmese people.
Scholars actually call his translation a masterpiece of dependency and development. He didn't invent the wheel here, he perfected it for his specific context. He intersected literary and oral texts spanning centuries to create a translation so robust that it is literally still the primary Bible used in modern-day Myanmar. How crazy is that?
Which brings us to Section 4, a twofold cultural legacy. This creates what Kachan Baptist scholar Lasang Dingran calls Judson's twofold legacy. It's a profoundly conflicting approach to his mission. On the one hand, Judson explicitly told his converts to completely discard all Buddhist ideas and behaviors. He was preaching a message of total rupture from their past. But on the other hand, just to even be understood, he indispensably relied on the exact same Buddhist worldview and language that he was actively telling them to reject. To really highlight this duality, just look at the word he chose for God. He controversially selected the Buddhist term paya. Now, in the Burmese Buddhist context, this word originally meant sacred things or revered objects, definitely not a supernatural creator. Yet Judson knew that to even begin communicating the concept of the divine, he had to borrow from the deep well of Buddhist thought. He even used Pali words related to the Buddhist concept of transferring merit just to explain Christian grace. He was literally using the philosophical tools of Buddhism to build a Christian theology. And his physical actions perfectly mirrored this super-conflicting legacy. He introduced very Western worship styles, setting up an American Baptist liturgy in Yangon. But at the exact same time, he recognized the absolute need to contextualize. For a while, he literally walked around wearing the traditional robes of a Buddhist monk. He also built a zaya, which in Burmese culture is a traditional open-air resting place for travelers and monks, and he used that as his primary space for teaching. He was walking an incredible tightrope between two entirely different worlds. Section 5. Sacrifice and Imprisonment. To truly understand his legacy, we have to acknowledge that the historical record documents profound, almost unimaginable human suffering. During the Anglo-Burmese War, Judson endured nearly 2 whole years of brutal imprisonment in the infamous death prison at Ava. We're talking constant starvation, disease, and the everyday threat of execution. During this horrific time, his precious translation manuscripts were actually miraculously hidden and saved by a faithful convert. And beyond the walls of the prison, his life was marked by just overwhelming grief, including the tragic back-to-back losses of his first wife Anne, his second wife Sarah, and several of his children to tropical diseases. Finally, Section 6, an enduring monument. In a really surprising anti-cult of personality twist, the very man who became this mythic hero in American church history actively tried not to be one. He went so far as to say, and I quote, "I am so very desirous of effecting a complete destruction of all my old writings." Yeah, Judson actively ordered his family and friends back in America to just burn and destroy his personal correspondence and journals. He was deeply, deeply afraid of becoming an idolized figure. He wanted all the glory to go entirely to his mission, not to himself. Driven by the extreme humility born from his mystical practices, he went to some pretty extraordinary lengths to erase his own prestige. He formally relinquished an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree that was given to him by Brown University. He also donated his private property, which amounted to over $10,000, which was an absolute fortune at the time, straight back to the mission board. He actively avoided the creation of a personal hagiography, making absolutely sure that his true lasting monument was his translation work, not his persona. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. 176 years later, with his translation of the Bible still literally open on desks and pulpits across Myanmar today, how does blending the legendary Christian pioneer with this nuanced, messy historical mosaic change the way we view him? When we see the real man, the one who wrestled with Catholic mysticism, relied heavily on Catholic and British translators, and actively utilized Buddhist vocabulary to spread his message, we discover a legacy that is just far richer and way more complex than any simple myth could ever capture. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive, and keep seeking the full story.